Hello and welcome to Where It's At, Pediatrics for Parents, a podcast for parents and caregivers of children. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Kyle, a practicing pediatrician at PAK Pediatrics in Kingston, Pennsylvania.
And my name is Alvaro Raimunde. I'm also a practicing pediatrician at PAK Pediatrics in Kingston, Pennsylvania. And we have this podcast. It's called Where It's At. And basically what we do here is we take topics that are coming around, topics that parents may be hearing about in the news, or maybe some topics that are sometimes a little controversial. And what we do is we talk about it in layman's terms and from a pediatrician's perspective in order to clarify some of the information that's out there and make it more digestible for the caregivers.
That's right. And timely information is what it's about. And we're going to give you some timely information today because episode 3 is on heavy metals and the various, there's been a report that came out from the FDA, or actually from Congress, actually, on heavy metals in baby foods. But then we're also going to talk about other metals that are involved really in children's growth and how some of them are important and how we even screen for some right there in the office and what you really need to know.
Yeah. And I think you hear the term heavy metals and you're like, oh crap, like that's Metallica, rock, corn. But you think heavy metals and that sounds scary, right? It's like, why would there ever be heavy metals in our food? But it turns out heavy metals are natural, right? They form part of Earth's crust.
Correct. So a lot of them came from Earth's crust, and then unfortunately, a lot of the heavy metals that we come in contact today with that are toxic ones, because there are good ones actually that we'll get to in a couple minutes, right. But the toxic ones are unfortunately due to pollution that have been happening over maybe hundreds of years. So they're really just hard to avoid because some of it comes from like you said, the Earth's crust, but then also we see it from gasoline pollution that has happened in soil from that has had gasoline in it, and gasoline we know is just everywhere. And then in some of the manufacturing that has been done, for decades, even centuries, and with lack of regulations, many years ago, that has leached into the soil. Even when people burn things, things get burnt and then it ends up going up into the atmosphere and then comes down and falls as rain. Right. So it's really hard for us with the heavy metals that are toxic to avoid them, right? It's just in general.
Yeah, it's almost impossible, I would say, to avoid heavy metals completely.
Right. This is not new. There's been reports in Consumer Reports, the magazine Consumer Reports, for years that have actually looked into heavy metals, particularly in baby and toddler foods. And they have called on the FDA for years to sort of come up with some sort of policy and change to that. There was one done in 2019 that Consumer Reports put out. There's actually Dr. Oz, if viewers remember, he actually made a big wave with this, talking about the heavy metals or arsenic that's in apple juice. This was going back several years. So it's not something new.
So again, heavy metals are natural. That you might even call them organic. But the ones that we're kind of focusing on would be mercury, lead, cadmium, and we're talking about arsenic. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about iron later on, because I think that's a very important...
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. I think that's a very important heavy metal. So why are we worried about these heavy metals? Why is it that if they are high levels in our bodies, why is that a problem?
So one of the things that we concern about in heavy metal toxicity, if you take them in large amounts, for instance, in industrial exposures or even in smokers, because there's heavy metals in smoke, you get concerned about issues you can have with cancer. Bone marrow suppression, things like that, especially if they're in high levels. But we're, again, talking about very low levels over long periods of time that are ingested in your food. And in children and babies, or toddlers and babies, we worry about, gosh, is this low-level exposure dangerous? And we know that if you're exposed to heavy metals at a young age, it can lead to potentially some neurodevelopmental issues.
Yeah, that are irreversible.
Children that are irreversible, IQ problems.
Definitely.
But the thing I think we have to keep in mind and be focused on, that there's many things that are involved in a child's neurodevelopment. So environmental, when we think about it, we talk about environmental factors, genetic factors, and social factors. So your genetic makeup has a large issue. It has a large impact on your neurodevelopmental outcome, your social aspect on how you live and how you're raised and where you're from, and then the environmental impact also. So it's just a part of the full picture of your child's development health, and I think you have to keep that in focus when we sort of talk about these things.
So let's dig in a little bit into this report and what it actually is saying. So
Sure.
The report came out basically because last year another report came out saying that 95% of the baby food they tested in that report had high levels of arsenic and high levels of other heavy metals, including lead. So that finally prompted Congress to release this report, which was released in February 2021. And basically what it said was that they found very high levels, or levels that are higher than expected, in baby foods, puffs, and orange juice even. So now the tricky part, this is what's kind of tricky, is we're using arbitrary cutoffs for these levels. The FDA does not have set levels for every single product out there. And so what's happened is manufacturers have set their own limits as to what these heavy metals, how much of these heavy metals can be in their food.
Right.
So I think that's part of the problem, is that there's no set guideline that companies have to universally meet.
Correct.
As far as the amount of heavy metals.
And the interesting thing, just in full disclosure, in that report also, when the various companies that were tested for this, such as Gerber and Earth's Best and several others, they came back and responded to those and said one of the companies said they were using outdated data, and another one said, I think it was one of the other companies actually said that they responded with giving the information to the government, but the government just never took the information from them and utilized it. So, I mean, I'm not negating what the Congressional Report says. I think it's very important, but just to sort of round this out, that you have to understand that maybe there's two sides to this story on really the heavy metals story and what it is in food.
And we don't know what level is actually harmful to the human body. And Dr. Kyle, you alluded to this earlier. It's not necessarily maybe that that these foods have a large amount of these heavy metals, but maybe the accumulation over time, because our bodies don't do a great job of clearing heavy metals
out of our bodies.
Yeah. So it's more, even though it's low amounts, if we're constantly being exposed to them over time, could it potentially be a problem? But again, we don't know what that magic number is.
Correct.
But we do know that it's not good. So we should take every measure we can to kind of minimize that.
Right. And in response to this report, the FDA actually said that they're going to start looking into this, and sort of what Dr. Ramundi was talking about is there being no established levels of what is safe. Really, no level of heavy metal is safe in your food or drinking water. But unfortunately, we can't probably eliminate it all.
Correct.
So the FDA is charged with looking into this, doing more research, trying to hold companies to a higher standard and try to define what the upper limit of normal would be. But really, when you look at what the FDA so far has said, the one issue that you can have with it is that they really didn't come up with any actionable items yet on what they're going to do about it. I think that that's one of the criticisms with the FDA is that they're not being making this a call to action. But in their defense, I think they have to sort of define things and understand the whole scope of it to come up with what those levels are, and then sort of say where they're going to.
We need more studies
these
for sure.
Companies to the fire, these food companies to the fire, because I think that yet has to be done. Albeit, though, the criticism also could be that this has been around for a long time. Why did it take this long to actually get there?
And actually the study had a few recommendations toward the end of the study, where one was that they should require mandatory testing of the finished products, because one of the things that some of the manufacturers were doing testing on individual products instead of the finalized product. So
Right.
towards the end, if you test the final product, even though the individual components met the requirements, once you add them all up, there's a cumulative effect. Another one was that the FDA should set those max levels. But again, we need to find what those max levels
Right.
are. So why don't we start talking about the heavy metals kind of one by one, the ones that we were talking about.
Okay. Sure. Do you want to start with, maybe we could start with arsenic.
Yeah. Arsenic. So I always laugh with arsenic because anybody who watches a good murder mystery knows that arsenic is the one that kills the unfaithful husband, right, by the wife. But
and it's not even made in the United States anymore. I don't think it's manufactured.
Yeah, I have no idea where I would find a bottle of arsenic.
You might have to fact check me on that, but
So I did pull up some numbers here last night as I was preparing for the podcast, just around what appropriate levels have been recommended. So for apple juice and bottled water, the maximum recommended level has been cited as 10 parts per billion. And this is parts per billion. I mean, this is a very, very small amount. However, for rice cereal, that level is 100 parts per billion, which is kind of like the quote unquote recommended level.
Right.
So what can arsenic and any heavy metal poisoning or any high levels of heavy metals can give you pretty much any multitude of side effects or effects, ranging from GI, stomach issues to neurological effects. But there was a study that I saw, I believe it was from Bangladesh, that studied the adverse effects in children that were exposed to water at 5 parts per billion over a period of, I believe, was 6 years. And it said that even at 5 parts per billion, there were some adverse effects of children drinking arsenic.
And the interesting thing, when you look at these two, is that, when you're talking about Bangladesh, and obviously there's various cultural issues that come into play and governmental regulation issues that come into play. But even in the United States, there's various parts of the country where you could find people ingesting more of one heavy metal than the other, just based on where they live geographically too.
Yeah, absolutely. So other than baby food, I also found, interestingly enough, that arsenic can also be found in big fish that we consume, like yellowtail tuna, for example. It's also found in beer and white wine and in Brussels sprouts. But this is not an excuse to not eat your Brussels sprouts.
That's right.
And one of the issues with
drink your wine.
Or drink your wine. But and also one of the other things with arsenic is that it competes with iron, binding iron. So if you have too much arsenic in your body, then iron has a harder time binding to your hemoglobin. So that's an issue as well.
Right. And, that was really brought up too with apple juice, is probably one I think is a big proponent that has potentially arsenic in it.
Right.
So
let's see, what other heavy metals do we have here?
So cadmium?
Yeah, cadmium. Yeah,
it's
cadmium.
Kind of an interesting one.
Cadmium's a very interesting one. I honestly didn't have too much information on cadmium before I started preparing for this podcast, but it's been defined as a carcinogen. It competes with copper and zinc in your body, and it's found in cigarette smoke, including e-cigarettes. So that got me, I looked into it a little bit more. So cigarette smoke has cadmium from the tobacco plants. Like we were saying earlier, all these heavy metals are in the soil.
Right.
And cigarettes, have tobacco, and also e-cigarettes have them too. So,
and even the pesticides, because it's a lot of the pesticides that are used on these plants. So, and even if the unfortunate thing is that with cadmium, you might think that was also used in some pesticides. So, even if they're not using it anymore, the difficulty is with these companies that are manufacturing our food, in the food chain, it's in the soil.
It's in the soil.
So, even if something was used 50 years ago as a pesticide, and now it's recognized that, hey, we can't be putting cadmium into our pesticides or whatever, the damage has been done.
It's been done.
And you can't probably eliminate them from everything that the plants are finding, because it's also coming from the rain that's coming onto the plant. So it's a complex problem.
It's very complex. So let's talk about levels in cadmium. So again, the limits for cadmium, as far as some sources that I found, 5 parts per billion in water, 10 is allowed, and in formula, 10 to 15 parts per billion have been found. And remember, these are very small amounts. Formula is safe, and it's okay to give your baby formula. There's nothing wrong with it. But what's interesting is, so 5 parts per billion allowed in water, about 10 to 15 in formula. One cigarette can produce 1 to 3,000 parts per billion of cadmium in smoke.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody is smoking next to their children,
Right.
all of that smoke, 1 to 3,000 parts per billion of cadmium can be exposed to your child.
Yeah. So you're probably, if you're worrying about what is being ingested in your child's food, you also have to look and see, again, remember what we said in the beginning of the podcast, your neurodevelopmental outcomes and your outcomes of your children are based on your genetics.
Yep.
The environment.
Absolutely.
And there the food that you eat, but and the social aspects. So this is part of the environmental part of it. You got to watch with the smoke.
Yeah, I was blown away. 1 to 3,000 parts per billion in smoke, and
Yeah.
we're worried about 10 in baby food.
Right.
So it's pretty impressive. But again, we're going to go through all of these heavy metals, and then we're going to talk about how we can minimize them. Did you have anything else on cadmium?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Mercury is another really common one. And at least me, when I thought of mercury, I always thought the thermometers.
Yeah.
Which they don't make with mercury anymore.
No, but incidentally, so PAK Pediatrics, has been around since 1967. And, this is going back several, this is sort of a little tangential story, but, we had, blood pressure cuff that was, had mercury in it. And, it fell off the wall one time and then all over the floor. And there was only when it shattered, there was probably about 4 or 5 beads, because it beads up, it's like water beads, and it rolls.
Right.
And it's a silver color. Looks like it'd be very fun to play with, but unfortunately, you can't. And so we had to call the environmental team, and they come in and close the whole area off in the office.
Oh my gosh!
Thank God no one was there at the time. This was before office hours, but they had to rope it off, and they're coming in their suits and everything, and having to clean. You would think, you could just take a.
Broom it off.
Take a broom it up and throw it away, But I mean, it was this involved procedure for just a couple beads of mercury, because there isn't that much in a blood pressure cuff. It's not like there's tons of mercury in it, but so it's kind of an interesting story that it's really taken serious.
Yeah, it's taken very seriously.
Yeah. And we used to put it in our mouths, in thermometers, but way back,
Absolutely.
Before I was born, of course.
Yeah. But since we don't see mercury in thermometers or blood pressure cuffs anymore, but we do see it in fish. Yeah. And that's probably the most common source of mercury in our diets, that we, and in our environment. The FDA levels for fish, 1,000 parts per billion.
Wow.
Yeah. And 2 parts per billion in water.
Okay. Yeah. So it's very, unfortunately, like we were saying, it's not the food, it's everything that you come in contact with, the air you breathe, and even the water that you drink.
Yeah. And I think, lead.
Yes.
Lead's a very important one.
Mm-hmm.
This is one, and Jeff, you mentioned this earlier, no level of heavy metals is safe in the body. That particularly is important for lead.
Right. Right.
There's no safe amount of lead in the body. Lead has been studied, at length, and has been proven to cause neurodevelopmental issues that are irreversible in children.
Right. And it wasn't that long ago. I remember even as a child, I'm dating myself maybe a little bit, but there was lead in gas. There was leaded gasoline. So when you went to the gasoline pump, there was unleaded, but there was still leaded available. I mean, those cars were old, but they were still on the road. And then in 1978 is when finally it was prohibited in the United States to put lead in paint. And that was and it's still, even though that law came in 1978, leaded paint is still the biggest exposure for children to lead.
Yeah.
Because it's the paint chipping in the old houses. and specifically the windowsills, because you think you paint over it, but it's the grinding of that window up and down that chips away that paint. And kids, toddlers and small children that are putting their things in their mouth are close to the ground. Believe it or not, just by being short in stature, they're breathing in too, more, and it's eye level, and they're able to breathe it in a lot easier than somebody that's taller. So, and Pennsylvania has the distinction of being one of the states that has one of the highest lead levels in the country. So it largely has to do with it's an old state, and it has a lot of old homes in it.
Absolutely, and we still see in the office many patients with high lead levels. And the only way that we would catch it is by routine screening.
Right. The other interesting thing with, besides the lead paint and that when people have to look at their homes, lead pipes in the house. Yeah. So lead pipes were found in older homes, and some homes still have it. But believe it or not, that's not the biggest problem, because many homes that have lead pipes have oxidized over enough, and there's enough oxidation and protection on the inside of those pipes from having water going through it so much that it really doesn't leach into the water anymore. But what you really have to be careful about is copper piping that you have in your house that maybe is old, because what they used was lead solder. So soldering you might look and say, well, gosh, my lead pipes are okay. I mean, I don't have lead pipes. I have copper pipes in my house. But if the soldering is made out of lead, that's worse than having just an old lead pipe in your house. So,
yeah. So, and then one of the issues with lead is that it competes with calcium, which we know calcium is very important for bone health. And since I've done it with all the other ones, some of the levels that have been recommended by the FDA as far as safe levels in different foods: 5 parts per billion in water, 100 parts per billion in candy.
Wow.
Yeah. And then 50 parts per billion in juices. Yeah. And then, so whenever we screen for lead, our cutoff is 5 micrograms per deciliter.
Right.
Anything over that would warrant some investigation and seeing what's going on. Just for I made a little calculation here. 5 micrograms per deciliter, which is our cutoff for further investigation in the child, equals to 50 parts per billion, which is what's in most juices, apple juices.
Really?
Yeah. That's pretty impressive. Now, it's not saying that you drink one juice and you're going to have 5 micrograms of lead in your body, but that's kind of like what it equivalates to.
Yeah, yeah. And you really also have to watch, in a global society that we are now, different countries have different regulations, and some don't have as much regulation as the United States. And you have to worry about toys too. That's the other thing I wanted to bring up. So children that mouth toys, if you have paint with a painted toy, rubber toy that has lead on it, lead paint, that can cause lead exposure. So you really have to watch where you're purchasing your baby toys from, and make sure it's a reputable source. A lot of times buying toys and such on eBay or secondhand toys that they may have handed down, if you don't know where they're coming from, it could be a potential exposure. So it's something to sort of think about.
Yeah. And since we're dabbing into that topic, let's talk about some secret sources of heavy metals. So toys are definitely one of them, especially if they're coming from overseas where they may not have as strict regulations for their paint. We talked about smoking, which is a secret source of arsenic and also cadmium. Cosmetics can also be a source of lead, especially if we're buying them internationally.
Right. And we have a lot of kids that like to play dress up too.
Absolutely.
So they wear
cosmetics
when they're having fun, and toy cosmetics coming from toy stores or buying them online, for kids, they might not be coming from reputable sources potentially. So you have to be careful.
Yeah. And a lot of companies, especially during COVID, they may be outsourcing some of their work and some of their materials. And even though the kids may not be ingesting the cosmetics, it could still be absorbed through our skin. Another source that I thought was really interesting is spices. So if we're buying spices from overseas, or maybe a company again is outsourcing and getting some of their spices from overseas, they can have, it could be, you could find, trace lead and other heavy metals from these spices. Again, because spices are herbs, right? And they're grown in the soil.
So it makes sense.
And it makes sense. And I didn't even think about it until I read it. So yeah, those are just a common, and we talked about fish as being a source
Right.
of some heavy
Right.
metals too. So what can we do to minimize all this?
Yeah. So it sounds very daunting, and it's like, gosh, I can't get away from these. And, what do I do? How do I protect my child, my growing child from exposure? And really it comes down to, and I'm saying this, I think, for the third time today, is recognizing that the foods and water we ingest is one part of your child's makeup. Because
Right.
again, it's environment, genetics, social, right? All make up your child's development. So it's just one part of it. It's not the full part. So we have to keep it in perspective.
Absolutely.
But we have to understand that we can't totally eliminate it. But we have to do our best to try to say, okay, well, we don't know, like you were saying, Dr. Ramunde, like what, acceptable, we don't have acceptable levels. So until that time, and until the FDA really gets behind, defining what those levels are, and then giving the companies, these food companies, the directive
Right.
on what they need to do, we have to try to do the best we can with what we're given,
Right.
knowing that we're exposed to it through our soil, through the ground, through the rain, through smoke, and through various processes that have been occurring in this country with various chemicals that expose our environment. So
I think having said all that, one of the things that I probably urge most every family or household to do is get your water checked. See what your water levels are, and make sure you know what the quality of your water is. They
Right.
check for lead, they check for fluoride. I think there's only one county in PA that has fluoride in their water.
yeah,
But definitely check for lead and other heavy metals in your
and
your
fluoride
water.
is good to have in your water. By the way, I don't
It
want to
is.
make it sound like
Right,
we
right.
don't want that, but that's actually a good.
Yeah, it's very
we
it protects
support
our
that.
enamel.
Mhm.
Absolutely. One of the other quote unquote tricks that I've read online from reputable sources, following our rules from episode one, but is whenever we're going to use our faucet water, let it run for a minute on the cold setting, and try not to use the hot setting of your faucet water. If you need to boil some pasta or something, don't take the shortcut of putting the hot water from the faucet and then doing that. Use the cold water and then heat it up on the stove.
Right.
And then, since we are talking about heavy metals and this report on the baby foods, one of the things that the American Academy of Pediatrics and us as pediatricians recommend is breastfeeding as long as possible.
Right.
We usually recommend breastfeeding for up to at least 4 to 6 months of age, if possible. We recognize that not every family can do this, but it is one of the great recommendations that we have.
Sure. And what foods really are highest in heavy metals that, like, as far as with babies that we really should
so
try
the
to
one the ones that we
minimize, not take out of the diet, but sort of just be
Yeah.
careful and cautious about.
So one of the most common ones that we think about, just because it's been in the media for so long, I mean, I'm talking years, is the rice cereal. And there's a lot of arsenic. For some reason, arsenic likes to bind to rice, especially white rice and brown rice. Brown rice actually has fairly compared to white rice, has higher levels of arsenic. But one of the things that we can do when cooking rice, because being a Latino here in the Latinx community, you can't tell a Puerto Rican not to eat rice. He's gonna laugh at your face.
Yeah.
But what we can do is make sure we rinse that rice off first. Now the downside is that it'll also rinse off a lot of the fortifiers that are added to rice to make it
Starch it up
Yep.
and make it thicker.
Yeah. So, but we can rinse out the rice a little bit better, and then after cooking, you can give it another rinse as well. And then the ones that tested lowest for arsenic levels were sushi rice and white basmati rice. And also, when your kid starts to get to 4 to 6 months old, where they're sitting up a little bit better, you talk to your pediatrician and they gave you the go ahead to start some introductory foods. It doesn't necessarily have to be rice cereal.
Right.
There are other options.
And
You should, we should talk to your pediatrician to see what options are best for your kid.
Yeah.
But there's oatmeal cereal. You can even start with fruits and veggies.
I think apple juice was another one that was very, high in arsenic, and I think also just trying to, when you think about it, root vegetables like I think sweet potatoes and potatoes, you have to watch a little bit because they're grown in the ground, so to speak, so they have maybe some higher exposure because they're in soil potentially. But the most important thing when you look at it is offering a variety of foods is
That's
just
huge.
really the most important, right? So the question is, should I be making my child all of their own food, because I can control it? Well, that might be an option for you, and it's probably a good idea to make some of your children's food by yourself out of fresh fruits and vegetables and meat, but recognizing that it's not a necessity, but because as we outlined earlier, even your fresh fruits and vegetables and that still are exposed.
Absolutely.
So it's not like there's some sort of magic voodoo going
Right.
on in the production of the baby and toddler fruits and vegetables in the company. I mean, it's happening when they're growing. So you could still have the exposure in your fresh fruits and vegetables that you're making yourself. So the big thing is to offer a variety. So even with rice, cereal, and babies, it might be a good idea to start off with oatmeal or barley or wheat. But, should you not introduce rice cereal to your baby? I think you probably still should offer it. But, don't be offering it 3 times a day with every meal, right? So you're sort of giving, it's all moderation.
Yeah.
Just like everything in life,
Just
right?
like everything in life.
moderation.
Absolutely. The one thing that may, put making your own baby food above buying it is that the baby food jars do go through a manufacturing process, and there is a chance that a little bit more may be added on. We don't know how much, though. I mean, this is almost speculation.
Right. It's all speculation.
And then, buying organic is not necessarily better because, like we said over and over and over again during this podcast, the heavy metals are in the soil. Organic food still grown in soil. Organic just means that, synthetic pesticides aren't used or not used as much. And synthetic fertilizer isn't used as much either.
And there's I'm not aware of any data even that says that organic food is better for your baby than non-organic. So I just want to put that out there. So for people that might be their choice to do that and feel healthier doing that, and I would support that. But knowing that medically there's no scientific evidence to say that is better for your baby, so no one should feel that they have to be feeding their baby organic food, but definitely is a choice for them.
Yeah. So what else do we have?
And then I guess maybe we could talk a little bit more in depth about lead. And I just, sort of what you alluded to, because the interesting thing is that what we said is, all of these heavy metals, arsenic and mercury and cadmium, like, we can't test for those, and we normally don't.
We don't.
But lead is one that we do, that we can be proactive about. And we talked a little bit about trying to, minimize that exposure by looking at your pipes in your house and your paint and things like that. If you're living in an older home that may have lead paint, trying to mitigate that the best you can. But we do test for that. And the recommendation is that, we test babies for that around 9 months to a year of age, because at that age is when babies start to mouth things a little bit more, start to get more mobile and move around. And then we do it again in our office at 18 months of age, because, again, that's when you're turning into toddlerhood and getting up and close to those windowsills and everything and wanting to see where those lead levels are. It may seem that if your lead level is normal at less than 5, but say it comes back at 3.
Right.
Again, like you said before, Dr. Rabunde, no level of lead is acceptable. So in my personal practice, and this might not be with everybody, but if you come back with a level less than 5, that's considered normal. But I still would test those kids again, probably in about 6 months, to make sure that I wasn't reaching an early exposure, because that's, one snapshot in time, that say level of 3, which is still normal. But maybe they were just starting to move and get mobile and be around something that was giving them exposure, and I would test it again just to make sure.
Yeah, because like we said, again, it's the prolonged exposure of these heavy metal levels in our bodies that can potentially cause an issue. So if we can remove the potential exposure, I mean, that's the treatment
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, and I guess so. We were just saying about how if your lead level is less than 5, you're okay, and maybe if it's not, you still would test for it again because no level of lead is acceptable. So if you have a lead level that's above 5, I don't think we want to get into treatment of like really high levels.
Right.
But my gosh, my level 6 or 7, it's a little above normal. Like what do we do with that as pediatricians?
Yeah. So education, I think, is one of the most important things we can do for our families, is educate them as to why these levels are increasing and educate them as to what the possible sources are. What we do is we contact the Department of Health and have them come to the house and do an evaluation of where these sources may be coming from. There is a treatment for very high lead levels, and it's called chelation, but it's usually reserved for very, very high levels of lead in the body, because it does have side effects and it's not something fun to go through. But most what we do is we monitor those levels closely, and we try to avoid those exposures.
And yes, like I said, it's really about education. And you could get a lot of information if parents are interested from the CDC, cdc.gov. Again, going back to our first podcast about doing proper internet research, .gov sites are very reliable, and the CDC gives a lot of information on lead. Contacting your local health department too, if you're concerned, is also a good resource.
Yeah. And there was a study mostly, made by homeopathic doctors and such, saying that, eating antioxidants such as blueberries and things like that may help. I wouldn't necessarily base my whole treatment on that, but eating fruits and veggies are probably a good idea.
No matter what.
Right? So maybe eating some blueberries and things like that may help. But again, this is not the pure treatment.
Sure. So what do you say we switch gears just a little bit here? I know we're talking about heavy metals as being dangerous, but believe it or not, there's also heavy metals that are important for our body's function and that we want to have good levels of in our body. And those include iron, copper. Zinc, all very important levels that we want to keep in our body and have actually ingest, because they are involved in bodily functions.
Absolutely.
So what do you say we talk a little bit right now just about iron, because that's one that we encounter. And again, we test for iron, again, not for high levels, but if you're deficient in it, and we want to help our children that are deficient in iron, because it's not an uncommon issue that we see in practice. So
it's fairly common.
Talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So iron is, like Dr. Kyle was just saying, is very, very important, because we need our red blood cells. Our blood needs iron in order to carry the oxygen that we breathe in to every cell in our body. So if we have low iron levels, our blood is less effective.
Right.
It isn't able to move oxygen as well and release it into the tissue. So one of the biggest issues is that some kids are deficient in iron. Some are due to dietary sources. Maybe they don't get enough iron in their diet. Or it could be that whenever they do eat iron in their diet, they're drinking it with a lot of milk. Now, this is a little controversial, but it is, pretty fair game to say that if you drink lots of milk with your iron source, that milk will bind to the iron, and then you won't absorb as much of the iron.
Right.
Iron is best taken with ascorbic acid, so acidic foods like orange juice or lemon juice or fruits.
It may help the absorption. And iron, just like certain, we were saying high levels of bad heavy metals could be detrimental to neurodevelopmental outcomes, but your brain needs good levels of iron because it needs good levels of oxygen. So it's important that we have good iron levels and that we're testing for them in young children, because we want them to have the best neurodevelopmental outcomes. To your point about milk, I commonly tell parents that when their kids switch over to whole milk at a year of age, that they shouldn't be drinking more than about 18 ounces a day, because you're saying it can cause low iron. That high that high level of milk could actually even cause microscopic bleeding into the stool, because it could irritate your colon, and then over time you get anemic. And I've actually had to transfuse a child before because they drank so much milk. I mean, we're talking high amounts that
That's
their
crazy.
hemoglobin drops so low because they had so much milk. So it's really we recommend 18 ounces or less.
Yeah.
So when do we test for iron in kids? When do we do that?
We like to check for hemoglobin, especially when the kiddos are around 9 months of age, along with the lead levels.
Right.
And if the hemoglobin's a little low, then we may check for iron specifically.
Right.
And
So
then,
it's indirect by looking for anemia first, right?
Right. And then we do it again, depending on the kiddo. If there's no signs and symptoms, again between 1 and 2 years of age.
Right. And then if they seem to be anemic, we may test for iron, or we may empirically or just start them on iron supplementation, because that is the most common cause for anemia in that age group.
Absolutely. And luckily there are some physical signs and symptoms that we as doctors know to look for in a kiddo that may be anemic, to kind of guide, if this kid needs to be checked for iron levels a little bit sooner than usual.
Mm-hmm.
We have the tools to do that.
Right. Very good. And then, copper and zinc are just important to make sure you're getting in your diet. We don't test for those, but
we don't test for those. The tests are fairly inaccurate, but copper and zinc are very important as far as biological processes that happen within our bodies. They are coenzymes, and they're cofactors and things like that make all of the cycles that go on within our cells to produce energy and things, so that it works well.
Yep. And where can we get those in our diet? Through what kind of foods?
Yeah, so to maximize our copper intake, you can in some cultures do it very well, but not so much myself. But organ meats, for example, if you want to eat some liver or some kidneys, you can do that. But some more palatable sources maybe can be dark green leafy vegetables.
Yes.
Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale, and spinach, and things like that. And how about sources of zinc?
Yeah, so sort of similar, the same. It's like leafy vegetables, nuts are another a good one, and meats also too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
and with iron, it's sort of the same thing. It's meats and
leafy vegetables.
And you could actually get some zinc also through some legumes and dairy actually also. So it's important to have a really well-rounded diet.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier too. I mean, it's important to eat a variety of foods. Let's just stick to one.
Yeah, and I think when you distill it down, if you teach your children how to eat healthy foods, and even when we talk to teenagers about eating, it's still the same thing. Eat a variety of foods, lots of fruits, vegetables, and lean meats, and some carbs, but not high on the carbohydrate side, but some.
Especially not the simple sugar carbs.
Right. And if you're doing those things, you'll probably hit all of these specific areas that you should be getting your heavy metals and other nutrients from. So you don't have to overthink it really.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the big take-home message here is that heavy metals, there are ones that we want to try to avoid because of their potential to cause problems within our body, but then there's also good heavy metals. And the best way to sort of navigate through this is take that Congressional Report with a grain of salt, because we know that it's very hard to prevent these heavy metals because they're found in our various parts of our food chain.
Absolutely.
And it's really about giving a variety of healthy foods to your children, and don't get stuck on one thing, and look for certain ones, like we were talking about, rice and apple juice, and maybe applesauce, just trying to watch some of those and giving them maybe in lesser amounts, but certainly not saying I'm not going to give my kid apples anymore.
Yeah, no, that
but we don't recommend juice anyway. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Something to keep in mind is at pakpeds.com, we have a blog, and we actually have a blog article that outlines pretty much everything we talked about in this podcast episode. I also want to remind everybody to like and subscribe to our podcast so that you guys are aware when we come out with new content. And it would also help to leave a review and a nice 5-star rating so that people looking for quality information about current pediatric topics know where to find it.
Very good.
Yeah.
And well, thank you for listening to Where It's At, Pediatric for Parents from PAK Pediatrics. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Kyle.
And I'm Dr. Alvaro Raimunde.
And we'd like to thank Cole Creative at Studio 16 South in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania for sponsoring this podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.
And where can we get those in our diet? Through what kind of foods?
So I'm not so sure about copper, actually.